The Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and the former now Defense Minister Yoav Gallant have had International Criminal Court arrest warrants put on them for b basically alleging that they are war criminals. Among them, crimes against, I believe, crimes against humanity, using starvation as a method of warfare, were few of the sort of alleged crimes or war crimes they have supposedly committed. So today we're gonna take a look at some, I think, if they did or sort of they were leaders of a nation that did something like that today, they would probably be at the Nuremberg trials with the Nazis, at least according to some of the recent things we are hearing from the International Criminal Court. So we will be mostly talking about allies during the Second World War, mainly Churchill, but we'll also talk about a little bit FDR and Truman, and sort of try to compare it, not necessarily compare it in a way that because they were much worse, they should also be something done against them. More of a it's ridiculous, basically. If you actually want to fight evil, what either side is doing, saying that that is a war crime is a submission to evil, to your enemies. So joining me today is James Valliant. Uh, Welcome to the Daily Objective. James, what would you like to start with? Would you like to start with a specific thing that happened during the Second World War? Try to compare it. Well,
Well,
let's start.
yeah, I mean, war is war. And if you are a pacifist, if you think that killing in self-defense or defense of others is morally wrong, even when they're under the threat of death or great bodily injury, well, then, of course, anyone engaged in warfare, even those who took down Hitler, would be bad guys in your mind. And I think it's also a mistake to look back and second guess policies with the information we have. We have to consider it in the context and information of the times. But look, just consider World War II. During World War II, I think I have the statistics here. Civilian deaths among Germans and Japanese, okay, the leading aggressors during World War II, and it's civilian deaths in Germany and civilian deaths in Japan during the war. German civilian deaths were, and these are estimates, of course, but the good estimates are somewhere between 6.6 to 8 point, to, excuse me, 6.6 to 8.5 million civilian deaths. Japanese, 2.6 to 3.5 million civilian deaths. And with Japan, I would just point out that, for example, the atomic bombs, that's only about 70,000 of them. So the conventional weapons that the Allies used in Japan killed literally millions of Japanese civilians, millions. Germans, even more. Now, of course, the Germans were responsible for a great many civilian deaths on the continent of Europe. At least 6 million Jews, 11 million civilian deaths that the Nazis were responsible for. That was more than just Germans, obviously. A lot of Poles and they collected Jews from a lot of countries on the continent of Europe.
Yeah, just to clarify, civilians that were in their own territory, not meaning,
Right.
not even counting all the ones that they've heard by, conquering or waging war, the Battle of Britain, for example.
Exactly. I mean, the firebombing of Dresden by the Allies, and this is British and American fighter planes, were dropping tons and tons of bombs, killing tens of thousands of civilians in Dresden. Or consider the American bombing of Tokyo, killing again tens upon tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 civilians just from one air raid. From one air raid, Americans killed tens of thousands of civilians in Tokyo. And that's just Tokyo. all the facilities that were being bombed, the whole Battle of Okinawa, which we mentioned on a recent podcast, when you add all of that together, we're talking about millions of Japanese civilians that were killed by Allied bombing just of Japanese forces or Japanese territory during World War II. And then you add Germans. I mean, we're talking about millions upon millions of civilians. And then in the wake of the successful Allied war, there were millions of survivors, ordinary civilians, Japanese and Germans, who may have opposed their own governments, who were left in the rubble starving. Did the Allies ever send humanitarian convoys into Germany or Japan, sending them food and medicine? No, they didn't. Netanyahu has done that repeatedly in Gaza. Now, is it his fault if Hamas steals that? Is it his fault if ordinary Palestinians attack the food convoys? No. But to claim that Netanyahu, is involved in a policy of intentional starvation is madness. And compared to anything else in the history of warfare, where it would be thought just absolutely insane and counterproductive to feed the population, the population is part of the war machine. If you're just baking bread in Germany during World War II, if you're just baking bread in Gaza, you are helping the Hamas war machine. Now, today, Hamas's military capacity has been pretty much leveled. So guess what? It's civilians in Gaza who are holding the remaining hostages. It is insane to say that you can't kill civilians during war. If someone puts a gun to my head and says, kill Daniel, you have a right to shoot at me in self-defense. My moral status, as I've said many times before, is sort of irrelevant to your right to self-defense. And anything that's part of the enemy war machine is a valid target, including any human being that is part of that war machine, working in a factory, a farm, baking bread, as I say. If you're baking bread for Germans during World War II, you're helping the Nazis. Now, there are people who say that we shouldn't have done the firebombing of Dresden. You shouldn't have done Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Well, when you actually compare the number of deaths at Nagasaki and Hiroshima, say, to the casualty figures during the conquest of Okinawa, and you project that to the number of civilian and military deaths that would have been involved in the invasion of the main island of Japan, it obviously made sense. It saved lives. It may have saved millions of lives, literally. And the same has to be true about Dresden. Now, I don't think it's fair to look back and say, well, was Dresden necessary? And knowing what we know now, no. Many German cities were leveled. But let's face it, every part of the German economy was a valid target of British and American fighter planes because they were part of the German war machine. They were helping keep Nazi Germany alive. Nearly all of the economy was geared around the war. It was a war economy. This is very similar, by the way, to the way Hamas organizes itself. So when you're faced with a real enemy, war is war. You've got to destroy the enemy's capacity to wage that war. And you've got to do it with moral conviction. If Netanyahu is a war criminal today, then Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt were war criminals, and Harry Truman were war criminals back then. And if there are people who say, okay, you shouldn't have done the atomic bomb, you shouldn't have done Dresden, then what? Would they want a negotiated settlement with Adolf Hitler? How much of Europe should still be under the Nazis, in their view?
Yeah, and sort of, because many of those people would say that, yeah, I mean, we've talked about that interview that Tucker Carlson did with one maybe historian. I'm not even sure how much he was of a historian, basically arguing that, yeah, Churchill was a criminal by sort of like today's standards, and many people would argue for it. Many people argued that Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a war crime, and sort of to those people, they are advocating for surrendering to Germany in that case, to Japan in the other case, and to Hamas in today's scenario. You have to realize that Germany has decided to declare war on the world. Basically, they nothing short of that. And Japan, I'm not super sure,
But
but I
right,
think Ayn Rand was against Second World War in a sense of going into Europe, and I know she was definitely against the First World War. But when it comes to Japan, Japan directly declared war on America. Uh, uh,
and yet
America.
she
Yeah.
said at that point, because Germany and Japan were allied, that it was appropriate for America to get involved. Up to that point, she was certainly of the position, let the Nazis and communists fight it out in Eastern Europe. And then if we need to, let America take on the one that survives. That would have been her preference, would be to see Hitler and Stalin going at it and killing each other. And there's a lot to be said for that. But on the other hand, the people who, when you're involved in a war, and when you're involved in a war like World War II with real enemies like Hamas and Hezbollah are, maybe at a different scale, but enemies of the same type, of the very same type, who are dying for their cause, in other words. You can't get in the way of them dying for their cause, or you're going to foster them remaining in power. As I say, if you don't want the full on, all out war with Hitler, if you don't, what you want him to survive, you want a ceasefire with Hitler, you want a negotiated settlement with Hitler, or Japan at the time, responsible for the rape of Manchuria. What were doing in China was unspeakable. What, you want the Japanese Empire with their kamikaze pilots aggressively taking over the entire Pacific region? Okay, well, you want a negotiated settlement with them? What kind of negotiated settlement could you get with Imperial Japan or Nazi Germany that wouldn't have meant the ongoing suffering of human beings, both, by the way, in their own victims within their own jurisdiction, not to mention their enemies? Uh, uh, that's absolute insanity. Anyone who says that Winston Churchill is a war criminal is taking a pro-Hitler position.
And yeah, and going to the something I really wanted to talk about, the idea of innocent Palestinians, or when we discuss it in the context of World War II, innocent Japanese, innocent Germans. I mean, if you look at the elections, for example, for Germany, when sort of, let's say, the last sort of real elections Germany had in, I think, 33, before in March, before Hitler completely took over, Nazis didn't have majority, and there was some opposition. There, you still had the SPD, you still had Centrum, you had opposition parties. But what about when Hamas got elected? What was the opposition there? Fatah
Right? Hitler
and
only won in a,
PFLP.
yeah, as you
So
correct, as you correctly point out, the Nazis only won a plurality. That means most Germans wanted some other party. Now, it's true a great many of them were communists, and the other parties weren't much to speak of either. But the point is that most Germans had voted for another party other than the Nazis in 1933. But Nazis did get the most, but it was just a plurality. Nothing like that with Hamas. And I mean, Hamas is wildly way more popular than the Nazis were
yeah,
among.
and that's important to remember. That doesn't matter. Once a nation declares war on another nation, that nation has to defend itself. That nation has to put their own citizens first and foremost. That's the purpose of a state, is to protect the individual rights of their own citizens. It is the other nation that is violating both the rights of their own citizens by the fact of being a dictatorship, by the fact of forcing people into a war. Um, and it has to do anything it can to stop it as soon as possible. Sort of the people who are saying that, and that you could make a valid argument against, let's say, the bombing of Dresden, that it wasn't like strategically effective. That's a discussion. If you want to make an argument that it didn't like actually make the war end faster, there is that. But the people arguing for it are not saying that. They just don't think anything like that should happen, similar to bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But if they did end the war faster, which I think it did, at least in the atomic bombing cases, and a different case I often like to bring up. I mean, the one of the charges against Netanyahu and Gallant is the using starvation as a method of war. Allies did that. They were bombing convoys in around Japan. The Japanese people were on the brink of on an actual brink of starvation, not what's happening
Right,
in Gaza. On the brink of
right,
starvation in Japan, they were pursuing unrestricted submarine warfare in the North Sea, basically completely destroying anything, just moving into Germany or just trying to move in.
correct,
Similarly, Germans were on the brink of starvation at the end of the war. That
correct.
was what made the war end faster. That was what allowed the Allies to, realize the protection of their own citizens by ending a foreign war that was started against them.
Exactly right. Exactly right. The starvation that the Allies intentionally inflicted, as I say, from the dawn of warfare. I mean, with old fixed fortifications, sort of made obsolete by mobile warfare in the 20th century. But before that, it was fixed fortifications, castles, fortresses, towers, walls, the famous walls of ancient Troy in the Bronze Age. The beginning of warfare, since there have been cities and walls, it's been a process of intentional starvation, surrounding a city, surrounding the fortress, starving it out through siege warfare. Starvation has been one of the primary tools of warfare since the dawn of warfare. And it's you say on one part of you says, "Well, how cruel to intentionally starve." No, how cruel it would be to feed your enemy. How stupid it would be to feed your enemy. You're prolonging the war. You're only making it longer, even if you're doing a military fight against it. Well, let's just send them food. What? No, you do everything you can within your power to disable the enemy war machine. And that includes food, water, anything else they might need to keep going with the fight. And if innocent civilians suffer, even innocent civilians, say in Japan, people who say who opposed Hitler or opposed Tojo during the war, they are going to suffer, and they are victims of their own dictators. Dictatorship, as Ayn Rand said in her great article, The Roots of War, to be found in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, dictatorship is the cause of warfare. Certainly it is in the modern world. And dictatorship is a state of war of a government against its own people. Right. And the more poor and impoverished and exploited those people, the sooner that dictatorship has to spread its aggression to exploit other people, i.e., cause war. And now look how primitive and backward Hamas and that kind of savagery is. Of course, they're immediately aggressors. Hamas takes over Gaza. Within weeks, days of taking over Gaza as their government, they're launching rockets into Israel. And now for what, 16, 18 years, they've been launching thousands of rockets into Israel. Now that was the prelude to the atrocities on October 7th. And you're telling me that the entire culture and economy, which is totally a war economy, in effect, they never wanted a peaceful, prosperous place for their people. Hamas was just a war economy whose entire existence was devoted to the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews. Now, obviously, they didn't have the power by themselves to do such a thing, but they're willing to do something like October 7th. And any response on the part of Israel is regarded as a war crime. That's absolute insanity. If Israel doesn't feed the people of Gaza, that's a war crime? By that standard, Churchill and Truman and Roosevelt were evil, monster war criminals. They should have been on trial at Nuremberg along with Hitler's agents. Monstrous. No, it's morality that's upside down. If you take that position, you're in effect saying, yeah, the world would be great if we still had Hitler, or maybe not Hitler, it's too long ago, but the Nazis, if the Nazis were still in power, at least to some extent in Central Europe. Wouldn't that be wonderful? That's what they're saying, in effect. That's the only alternative I can find. How much of China do we want to give to Imperial Japan? You know, the nice way the Japanese were treating China when they invaded it. How much of it, how much human suffering for how many decades would you want to prolong? How long would you want to prolong World War II? How long would you want to prolong? And apparently, our policymakers in the West today want to see an endless war in the Middle East. They never want Iran to be dealt with. They want forever to be innocent innocent Israeli civilians. How about them? How about we think about them for a minute? They're not the aggressors. They're not a culture that wants to destroy everyone around them. They would love it if there was peace. But how many innocent Israeli civilians have to be displaced from their homes, have to run into bomb shelters every other day? I mean, what kind of an existence is that? Does that have to go on and on? No, there is no moral justification for that.
We have a super chat from Roland. Thank you so much. He says, "But would they hang Stalin?" Well, I, I don't really care. I mean, I'm not gonna defend Stalin for what he did or something. So I have no reason to sort of even look at the war crimes committed by the Soviet Union or by Stalin and sort of saying like that was okay in the context of war. Stalin was leading pretty much probably the second most totalistic regime that was existing at the time.
I regard the fight against Hitler to be a noble one, and so Churchill to be a great hero. But the greatest mistake of the Allies during World War II was allying themselves with Stalin. Whatever aid America sent to Russia, they could have used, as Ayn Rand has pointed out. We could have used it ourselves in fighting the war. And I think we could have used it more effectively than Russia did. Although Russia inflicted many casualties, I don't think that we should have ended up giving a third of the globe to the Soviet Union. And that began when we were allies with them in the fight against Hitler. What you don't do is you don't ally yourself with someone just as if you're going to take on Hitler, you don't ally yourself with in effect another Hitler. It's a big mistake. And it ended up meaning decades of people living under the slavery of the Soviet Empire.
I mean, not just decades. We are still feeling the ripples of it now. I mean, you mentioned the taking over of Eastern Europe, but think about would Iran have their revolution without the support of Soviet Union? Would any of would the Palestinians be able to rise up, or any Arab nations be able to rise up against Israel or fight against Israel without the support of the Soviet Union? Would China be able to basically become, would Mao be able to take over China without the support of the Soviet Union? I mean, I don't want to make the other side make, I think when it comes to Chinese Civil War, I think even if the other side won, it might have had a similar system. And I don't think we would have seen like a complete Taiwanese type of democracy if it happened, because even the other side, the Chinese of China, was very authoritarian at the very least. But still, pretty much the idea of communism wouldn't exist if Soviet Union wasn't able to persevere after the Second World War.
Yeah. So if we're going to criticize Roosevelt and Churchill, it's not for the civilian deaths in Germany and Japan. It would be for their alliance with Joseph Stalin. That would be my main criticism of them, frankly. Now, I don't like Roosevelt's behavior before the war, but on the other hand, by far the biggest mistake that America made and the Allies made was to ally themselves with Stalin, which basically ended up assigning a third of the globe to communist tyranny. And that's a pretty rotten outcome. That's why you don't negotiate with monsters. That's why you never negotiate with monsters. That's why any negotiation with Hezbollah, Iran, or Hamas is wrong, morally wrong. These are aggressive dictators. What do we have to gain from negotiation? What values or interests do we share that we could come up with a decent, legitimate compromise with those kind of people with? It's non-existent in my mind. You cannot negotiate with people like Hamas or Iran. Impossible. And wrong, morally wrong. You only be defeating your own interests if you did so. No, you make them surrender. You eliminate their capacity to do you harm altogether. You psychologically crush them and indicate to them it will happen again should they try to be aggressive again. That's the only way to win a war. And you terminate it, and you terminate it quickly, and you don't let civilian suffering on both sides go on and go on and go on forever and ever. That is the least humanitarian alternative, it seems to me.
We have a super chat from PC. Thank you so much. He says International Kangaroo Court of Injustice. So
Indeed.
I'll just mention it just so we know the difference. Hopefully, we won't have to talk about them for a long time. You have the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. The basic idea is the Court of Justice deals with nations, Criminal Court deals with individuals. So ICJ, the Court of Justice, deals with Israel, while ICC, the International Criminal Court, deals with Netanyahu specifically. So just so
Yeah.
hopefully we won't have to think about it for a long time. We also have a super chat from PC. Again, thank you so much. He says, US came in too late in 1941.
It's arguable about that, and certainly Roosevelt was doing everything he could to trick America into a war with in Europe, which many Americans opposed at the time. But as I say, whatever your opinion about that, surely the alliance with Stalin was by far the worst mistake American policymakers made at the time. And after the attack of Pearl Harbor, America was the victim now America was the latest victim of imperial Japanese aggression, and they were closely allied with Adolf Hitler. At that point, I think it was out. You can't argue at that point that America didn't have to get involved. In my mind, Churchill was a hero in part because he understood the danger of Hitler before everyone else. He was the enemy of Hitler politically in Europe. I mean, I know Churchill's been criticized a lot, but if you're going to criticize Churchill, then in effect you're defending Adolf Hitler. Churchill was the great nemesis of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, and to be sincerely believe that Churchill was a war criminal, and there are people who think that, is to sincerely be defending Adolf Hitler, in my estimation.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, any dictatorship, well, for one, has no legitimacy to exist and is a threat to any freedom-minding nation. That is not necessarily a reason to, risk the lives of your own people to go on a crusade against every single dictatorship there is. So yeah, once America was attacked, once it was clear, and I think before, through for example, the Lend-Lease Act, I think you could make a reasonable case for supporting Britain and France, or mostly Britain, I think, but not Soviet Union, before even America has entered the war.
America sent a whole lot of aid, not just to Britain, but to Russia. Madness.
And I think UK paid it off only in like early 2000s or something like that, officially. We have a super chat from PC. Again, thank you so much. He says, my great grandparents on mom's side perished in Holocaust. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. We have a super chat from Bonnie. Thank you so much. And a super chat from Christian. Thank you so much. He says, many people today see Hiroshima and Nagasaki as war crimes. We've talked about that. I disagree with them to their shock. Back then, the West still believed in victory. Today, we are ceasefire worshippers. I think that nicely summarizes
that means dictator worshippers, and dictatorship perpetuators is what it means. It means war perpetuators, because dictatorship is inherently a state of war itself and is the cause of war.
And it necessitates war because it is unable to produce. Dictatorships are fundamentally. That's why when you have, for example, Russia, they can only rely on exporting national resources, which again is trade with free nations. They can only sort of succeed to the extent we allow them, because they are useless. They are unable. So that's why also we'll talk about actually environmentalism on today's reality show. We'll be talking about Palestinian environmentalism because don't you know, James? Israel is committing an ecocide in Gaza. So we will be talking about that on the reality show in just about a minute or so.
Can't miss that.
Thank you, James, for joining me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and bye-bye.
Be safe.